When my wife and I first got married, money was tight. We had a small apartment in a nice neighborhood, the kind of place where nobody locked their doors. Actually, I'm not that sure if nobody locked their doors because I didn't go around trying to open everyone's doors. It wouldn't be such a great neighborhood if I did. Anyway, even though we loved the location, it was pretty far from work for both my wife and I. To make matters worse, our old car was on its last leg. It was breaking down regularly, and when I brought it to the auto shop, the mechanic told us that it would be cheaper to simply get a new car rather than doing the repairs. I discussed it with my wife later that night. She's a social media manager for a tech startup, so she's on Facebook all day. Therefore, she knows it inside and out. She suggested that we check Facebook Marketplace for a used car. I agreed, since it seemed like a good way to save money. After scrolling around for 10 or 20 minutes, we saw a posting for a 2014 Ford Taurus for a ridiculously good deal. It was in great shape, although it had over 100,000 miles on it. A small drawback considering the price. My wife was skeptical, since the deal seemed too good to be true. But I figured it was worth it, at least to check it out. We sent a message to the seller, making sure to insist on a test drive. He replied after about an hour, and agreed to arrange a test drive for the following day. My wife had to work that day, so I went alone. We agreed to meet at a Walmart parking lot on the other side of town. I had to take the bus, since our old car was in no condition to be driven. As I made my way towards the parking lot from the bus stop, I noticed a man standing next to a car that matched the one in the ad. That must be him, I thought to myself. He noticed me as I got close and offered an awkward wave. I waved back politely. "Hey, we spoke through Facebook?" I said. Yes. You're here for the car. I'm Raymond," he said nervously. He was a young man, probably mid-20s. Large, but not in an intimidating way. In fact, he had kind of a baby face. One thing did strike me about this guy, though. He was nervous, and I mean really nervous. He was actually shaking, but it was probably none of my business, so I didn't worry about it. We jumped into the car and started the test drive. I was immediately struck by how clean and tidy the car was. The strong scent of bleach burned my nose. It makes sense to clean a car before selling it, I get that, but this was on another level. You would have to smell it to understand. That being said, the car was great otherwise. It was just as described, and it seemed to be in great condition functionally and cosmetically. The bleach smell would wear down over time, so it wasn't a deal breaker. I bought the car on the spot and paid in cash. After transferring ownership of the car, I dropped the seller off at the bus stop. I was about halfway home when I noticed the flashing lights of a police car in my rearview mirror. After I pulled over to the side of the road, the officer approached my window. "License and registration, please," said the officer. I handed him my license and the freshly printed papers for the car. He glanced at them for a few minutes and handed them back. Then he said, "Looks like you just took over the registration for the car today." "Yes, sir. I just bought it," I replied. "The reason I stopped you is that this car matches the description of one that was used in a murder. Do you mind if I take a look?" The gears started turning in my mind, and everything started to make sense. The too good to be true price, the nervous seller, and of course, the strong smell of bleach. This was it. I bought a car from a murderer. I immediately told the officer everything. Luckily, he believed me, and of course it was not difficult to track down the previous owner of the car. I thought I might be asked to testify or help with the investigation in some way, but the call never came. From what I heard on the local news, the seller ended up getting life in prison for murder, and it turned out he used the car to dump the body. They found traces of blood in the trunk and throughout the interior. I guess he didn't use enough bleach. This happened when I was in high school. I went to the largest school in my city. There were at least a few thousand students, so it was easy to get lost. Even until my final year, I would meet people in my class who I swear I had never seen before, only to find out that we'd been going to the same school this whole time. Maybe part of that is on me for not being more social, but that's another story. Facebook was still relatively young back then, and it had just finished taking over my school. I was getting tons of friend requests from my classmates that I'd gotten to know throughout the years. This was back when social media friends were all people who you actually know in real life. Imagine that. I will have to admit that I did enjoy that little dopamine hit every time I saw a new friend request pop up. And I would eagerly accept each and every one with little consideration. One day, I got a request from a guy named Michael. His profile said that he was a student at my school, and we had a lot of friends in common. I clicked accept, not giving it a second thought, even though I didn't recognize him. Like I said, it was not uncommon for people to pop up who I had never met. If we were classmates, then why not connect on Facebook? A few days later, I was doing some homework on my computer. I had Facebook open as usual, and I got a message from Michael.
"Hey, how's it going?"
He wrote. "Hey, good. How are you?" I replied. We then sent a few messages back and forth, exchanging pleasantries mostly, until I eventually said, "How do we actually know each other?" He said that he went to my school, but didn't give much detail otherwise. We chatted for a while longer, then I called it a night, not getting much homework done. When I woke up the next morning, I walked over to my desk and turned on my computer. I had a ton of new messages, at least 30. I excitedly opened them, but was disturbed to find that they were all from Michael. A bunch of them just said, "Hey," or "Why aren't you answering?" I scrolled through them some more, and they got even more vile. Some that I don't even want to say, even some that were outright threats. After that, I decided to take a closer look at his profile. First off, I noticed that in his profile picture, he looked much older than high school age. He must have been at least 25, with a beard and baseball hat. Also, he had lots of pictures, but none of them included anyone that I could recognize from school. Starting to feel suspicious, I looked at our mutual friends so I could ask around at school that day. I went to school, and when lunch hour came, I headed to a spot in the hall where my friends usually meet. It was a wide open square section, with lockers on all sides. I talked to some of the people who were friends with Michael on Facebook. Nobody had heard of him. I guess I was not the only one who blindly accepted friend requests from strangers. By then, I was pretty sure that Michael was a creeper, and I was feeling nervous. He knew enough about me that if he wanted to find me, he could. The rest of the day dragged on. I dreaded the thought of checking my Facebook messages. My school had a strict no cell phone policy, so I couldn't check until later. After school, I went home and nervously turned on my computer. I opened Facebook and was surprised to find that Michael's profile was gone. He had deleted it. Part of me was relieved, but in a way, it was even more scary to know that he was out there and I had no way to prove what he had done. I've considered the possibility that it was one of my friends playing a joke, but I don't think so. When I looked through his profile, he did have quite a few pictures and over 200 friends, so it would have taken some effort to put that together. I looked over my shoulder for several months after that, expecting to see him hiding in the bushes or something. Fortunately, that never happened, and I never heard from him again. I've always been cheap with money. It's something my mother taught me from a young age. This used to be a point of shame for me, but as I've grown up, it's become a point of pride. Even though I'm reasonably well off financially now, I still keep an eye out for a good deal. Thrift shopping and bargain hunting will likely always be a part of my life. Some call it minimalism, I call it being cheap. I use Kijiji and Craigslist, but usually have more luck with Facebook Marketplace. Sometimes I spend hours scrolling through the free section, hoping to find something good. It's very rare to find anything worthwhile in the free section, but there was one exception. I spotted a post for a free mountain bike on Facebook Marketplace. It looked almost new. It had a red frame with nice big tires and those shock absorbers on the front wheel. I'm not much of a cyclist. I'm not much of an athlete at all, to be honest. But I had been meaning to lose a few pounds, and this might be good motivation. I figured I could try it out and either keep it or sell it for a few bucks. I typed a message to the poster and clicked send. No more than a minute later, he replied. He said his name was Alan and that it was still available. He promptly sent his address and also told me to come by at exactly 8:15 p.m. the following day. It seemed a bit odd that he was so precise with the time, but I figured he was just busy. I typed a reply and asked if we could meet in a public place. It's always a good idea to meet someone in public, since you never know who you're dealing with. He replied and said that I needed to pick it up from his house. That was understandable since it was such a good deal. I agreed to meet at his place since it was not far from my work. I finished work at 6 p.m., so I had some time to kill until 8:15, which is when I was going to pick up the bike. I went to a McDonald's for dinner, taking my time in order to run out the clock. However, by the time I finished, it was still only about 7:30. Even though we agreed on 8:15, I figured I would go and see if he was ready. His place was only about 15 minutes away from the McDonald's, so I took off thinking I would be about half an hour early. The neighborhood was quaint. All the houses looked old in a charming way. As I approached his house on the left side of the street, I noticed another car had stopped and a man was getting out. Great, I thought to myself. That must be Alan, just getting home. I walked over to the man and said, "Hi, are you Alan?" No, I thought you were Alan. I'm here for the bike," he replied. Oh, great, I thought. He promised it to someone else. What a waste of time. Just then, the door to the house opened and a large man in his 40s stood in the doorway. He was at least 6 feet tall, with a thick build. A sinister grin appeared on his face after I turned to look at him.
Please come in. The bike is waiting,
he said. Both of us? I stuttered.
Yes. There are two. Come in and help me get them.
The other man and I exchanged uncomfortable looks. At this point, neither of us believed that there was a bike, or two, or whatever. I jumped back into my car and drove away, Alan glaring at me from his front porch. This may not seem like the most terrifying story ever, but if you could see the way Alan was staring at us, it would make your skin crawl. Also, the ad didn't say that there were two bikes, and I believe that he made this up to lure us into his house. His actual plans will remain a mystery, and that's fine with me. I'm Jarrett, and this happened a few years ago when I was a student. I was in my 3rd year of college studying business administration. I went to a different school for my first 2 years, and I had just transferred to a larger state school. I was filled with excitement and nerves as I packed my bags and headed off to my new home, a shared house with a bunch of strangers who would be my roommates. I found them on Facebook, and honestly didn't know much about them. I didn't have a lot of options though, and I certainly couldn't afford my own place. When I arrived at the house, I was immediately struck by its charm. It was an older townhouse right near the school, far from luxurious, but definitely good enough. I felt a sense of relief that I wouldn't be living in a tiny dorm. As I walked through the door, I was greeted by the sounds of laughter and chatter coming from the living room. I followed the sound and found my new roommates, all of them busy getting to know each other. There was Alex, a tall, muscular guy with a friendly smile who was studying engineering. Then there was Mike, a smaller guy with a sharp wit who was studying psychology. And finally there was David, a quiet, reserved guy who was studying computer science. They all welcomed me warmly and made me feel at home. I then found out that I was not the only one who was new. They had all met on the Facebook group as well. It turned out that Alex and Mike had also transferred from other schools, and David was the only one who was returning. The first few weeks were great. We all bonded quickly, spending our days studying and attending class. In the evenings, we would cook dinner together and watch movies. It was like I had found a new family, and I was grateful for it. But then, things began to change. I was really bonding with Mike and Alex, but David became more and more reserved over time. It got to the point where I would see him only once or twice a week. He would spend hours locked in his room, only coming out to grab food or use the bathroom. I don't think he was even going to class anymore. He became increasingly aggressive, snapping at anyone who tried to talk to him or ask him how he was doing. I started to feel scared around him and kept my distance. That seemed to help, but his behavior was really creeping me out, and around that time, I started to feel like somebody had been in my room. Things were out of place. I keep my room very tidy, so it's easy for me to notice if my laptop has been moved or if my clothes have been messed with. I didn't want to think it was true, so I tried to ignore it and moved on. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise coming from outside my door. I got up to see who it was, and I was shocked to find David just standing there. I looked up at him, and he had a really creepy look on his face. Then I looked down from his face and saw that he was holding a pocket knife. It wasn't unfolded or anything, but still it was really scary. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me, and I stumbled back screaming for help. I then tripped over the bed and hit my head on a nightstand. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital, where I was told that David tried to kill me. The doctor said that it could have been a lot worse. I couldn't believe it at first, but as my memory returned, I came to accept it. I was told that Alex had heard me scream and managed to stop David and subdue him. Then he called the cops. I was then told that David was arrested. I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I had to withdraw from college and move back home to recover, both physically and mentally. It's been a long and difficult road, but I'm slowly starting to heal. Looking back, I can now see that the warning signs were everywhere, but I didn't want to believe that a friend could be capable of such a thing. It's a hard lesson to learn, but one that I will never forget. I've come to realize that sometimes, even the people closest to us can be capable of great harm. I've returned to college, this time in a different city and with a new set of roommates. I was nervous at first, but quickly found that my new roommates are kind, considerate people who have become my closest friends. I am grateful to have them in my life and have a second chance at college. I still have nightmares about what happened, but I am learning to face my fears and move forward. This story is about a really horrible thing that happened to me. I'm 28 now, and it was about 5 years ago. It all started when I put my laptop up for sale on Facebook Marketplace. It was a high-end laptop, and it was only 1 year old, and it still worked really well, so I figured somebody would be willing to pay a fair price for it. I had come into tough financial times, the details of which I'd rather not get into. That's why I decided to sell it, and try to get another year out of my old one. I received a message from someone who was interested in buying it. They offered me a price that was slightly higher than what I was asking for. A big red flag looking back, but I ignored it. I really needed the money, so I couldn't resist. We agreed to meet up in a parking lot of a grocery store near my apartment. I was excited about the prospect of making a quick sale and getting rid of my laptop. I grabbed my phone and headed out the door, walking the short distance to the parking lot. It was a warm summer day at around 7 p.m. The sun was starting to set, so I knew it would be dark soon. I was hoping to be done before then. When I got to the parking lot, there were a few people milling about the store, but I didn't pay much attention to them. I was focused on finding the buyer and completing the transaction. I walked around for a while, and eventually saw a man leaning against a car in the far corner. I walked over to him, laptop in hand. When I got close, he waved at me, confirming that it was him. He was a tall, muscular man, with a rough, unshaven face and a stern-looking expression. I felt a sudden sense of unease, but I tried to ignore it. After all, I was there to sell my laptop. I opened it up and showed it to the man. He asked me a few questions about its specs and performance. Then he asked me to unlock it so he could make sure it worked. Then I handed it to him, and he gave me the cash. I was counting the money when he suddenly grabbed me by the wrist and twisted my arm behind my back. I cried out in pain and tried to pull away, but he was too strong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, then held it to my throat.
Don't move.
He growled.
Just hand over the cash, and forget we ever met.
I was terrified. I'd never been in that kind of situation before, and I didn't know what to do. I quickly handed back the cash, and the man backed away, still holding the knife. He looked at me with a neutral expression. It was like he did this every day. Didn't seem to faze him one bit. He then turned and ran away. I watched in disbelief as he disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there in shock. I quickly realized that I'd just been robbed. I couldn't believe what just happened. I was shaking and my heart was racing as I pulled out my phone to call the police. They arrived after a few minutes, and I gave them a description of the man and told them that he left on foot. They told me that they would do their best to find him, but that was little comfort to me. The rest of the day was a blur. I felt dazed and disoriented, like it was a dream. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't sit still. I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of what had happened. I was angry, scared, and overwhelmed. I'd never felt so vulnerable and helpless in my life. The police never caught the man who robbed me. I never saw my laptop again. Obviously, the guy's profile was gone when I checked. Looking back, I know I could have checked the profile to see if it was a real person. That's one of the advantages of using Facebook Marketplace over other sites like Craigslist. You can check their profile and vet out the predators. I didn't do that, and this is what happened to me. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I live in the United States on the Northeast. This story is about something that happened to me last summer, but it still scares me when I think about it. My roommate had moved out and left me with an extra room in the apartment. I couldn't afford to keep paying the rent on my own. I'd heard of people renting out their spare room on Facebook, so I decided to give it a shot. I created a post with a picture of the room and a brief description of the apartment, then I hit post. Within a few hours, I started getting responses. The first reply came from a guy named Jeremy, who said he was interested in moving in. He seemed friendly enough, but something about his tone made me uneasy. His voice was very monotone, almost robotic. I looked past it though. Not everyone's comfortable talking on the phone. I suggested that we meet up in public first. That way we could get to know each other. When I suggested that, he refused and said he just wanted to move in right away. That gave me a really bad feeling, so I told him that I was going to move on and find someone else. Then he sent me a really angry message, including some horrible insults and even threats. The scariest thing happened next. He sent me a picture of a black handgun, just sitting on a table. I had no way to know if it was really his, or if it was just a picture that he found somewhere to scare me. After that, I blocked him and went to bed. A few days went by, and then I received another response. This time it was from a man named Justin. He seemed nice, and we exchanged a few messages. Then he asked if we could meet at a bar for a drink to discuss the room. I agreed, and we made plans to meet at a local bar. When I arrived, I saw a man sitting alone. He looked like he was waiting for someone, so I walked up and introduced myself. It was Justin, so I took a seat, and we got to talking. We chatted for a while. He told me about his job and his hobbies. He seemed normal, and I was starting to feel more comfortable with the whole thing. After a while, though, I noticed something about his voice. It sounded too familiar. He had that same monotone voice as the other guy from before. I became suspicious that Justin was actually Jeremy, so I made an excuse to leave. I gathered my things quickly and said goodbye, but as I was leaving, Jeremy grabbed my arm and said,
"You can't run away from me that easily."
I was scared and started to panic, but then I remembered that I had my phone with me, so I pulled it out with my other hand and dialed 911. When he realized that, he released me, and I ran out of that bar. The operator told me to stay on the line, and within a few minutes, the police arrived. Jeremy was arrested, and I was shaken, but grateful to be safe. When the police searched him, they found a gun that looked really similar to the one in the picture that he'd sent. If I had allowed that guy to come back to my apartment to look at the room, then I could have been in big trouble. Luckily, that didn't happen, and I got away. I still have no idea what that guy's problem was. I ended up finding a roommate through some of my friends. In my opinion, that's a much better way than meeting strangers online. If at all possible, that's what I would recommend. This all happened about 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s. I was scrolling through Facebook one day, when I noticed I had a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. Their profile was just a silhouette. Their name was unfamiliar to me. I usually don't accept friend requests from people I don't know, but for some reason, I felt curious about this person. I accepted the request, and we started chatting. The stranger, who called himself Mark, was charming and friendly at first. He asked me about my life and my interests. We quickly bonded over our shared love for music. I found myself looking forward to our conversations and spending time chatting with him. Mark seemed genuinely interested in me, and that really drew me in. However, things started to take a dark turn when Mark started asking me more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, my schedule, and even started commenting on my photos and posts. I started feeling uncomfortable and decided to end the friendship. That's when the real horror began. I started receiving messages from Mark at all hours of the day and night, asking me why I hadn't been replying. When I refused to respond, he began sending more and more disturbing messages, including one where he referenced the coffee shop where I worked at the time. And I knew for a fact that I'd never told him any personal details like that. I became afraid for my safety and decided to go to the police. They told me that because we only communicated online, there was very little they could do. There was no way to know if we were even in the same country. I felt helpless and alone, unsure of what to do next. Then he started leaving scary messages on my phone, and even threatened to show up at my house. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do. I started to feel like I was being watched. All this trouble from someone I'd never even met. He didn't even have a profile picture. For all I knew, anybody on the street could be him, and I would be oblivious. My paranoia grew over time, and I started sleeping with the lights on. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows every night. I was always looking over my shoulder. My once normal and happy life became a constant state of fear and anxiety. One day, I received a message from Mark saying that he knew where I was and that I couldn't escape him. That was the final straw. I called the police, and this time, they took me more seriously. I guess it made a difference to them when he threatened to come to me in person. I'm not sure why they didn't do that before. I eventually heard back from the police. They told me that they contacted Mark and gave him a warning to leave me alone. I never heard from him again after that, but I was really scared for months, if not years afterwards. I still use social media, but I'm much more cautious about who I accept into my life. I've learned to be vigilant and trust my instincts. The internet can be a wonderful place, but it can also be dangerous. This happened last year when I was 15. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, but I did have a few good friends in the area. Even though I had been there my entire life, there were still neighbors who I didn't know at all. Maybe we were unfriendly. Sue me. One day my friend Kate and I were messing around on the sidewalk in front of my house. We were playing around with sparklers and other stuff like that. Suddenly, Kate froze and told me to turn around and look behind me. I did as she said, and I could see in the house across the street there was somebody peering at us through the window. He had the lights off, so I couldn't tell what he looked like. It seemed creepy, but like I said, we don't know all of our neighbors, so it could be nothing. Kate and I went back to what we were doing. However, a few minutes later, she told me to look again. This time, there was a woman with him at the window. They were just staring at us. Kate and I began to feel uneasy, but again, we ignored them. As the sun went down, I walked back to my house and Kate went back to hers, which was a few blocks away. Later that evening at around 10, my phone lit up. I was watching the latest episode of Orange is the New Black, so I ignored it at first. Then I got another, and another. So I finally picked up the phone and looked at the screen. The alerts came from Snapchat. Someone added me. The username was Jaden with some numbers at the end, and he sent a picture. I waited until the episode was over, then I opened it. It was just a black screen with a message saying, "Hey." I wasn't scared at that point, more annoyed. If someone's going to message me, it's nice for them to say a little more than "hey," so I ignored it. About 6 or 7 minutes later, I got another message from the same username, and again, it was a black screen. This time the message was,
"Why didn't you answer?"
I ignored it again and went back to Netflix. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't even look at it. Throughout the next episode, I got about 4 more alerts, all of which I ignored. I went to bed shortly after. When I got up the next morning, I looked at my phone. I was shocked to see 11 more Snapchat messages. Some of them were black screens from that Jaden username asking,
"Why aren't you answering?"
or,
"I know you're awake. Answer me."
The last one, however, is what really freaked me out. It was a picture of my house taken from across the street with the message,
"Answer me now."
I wasn't sure, but it looked like the picture was taken from where I saw that creepy couple staring at Kate and I. Unfortunately, I didn't get a screenshot, but I think you can forgive me for not thinking clearly at that moment. I did block him though. A few days went by and I didn't hear anything from this mysterious account. However, one day when I was in class, someone added me. It was the same name as before, but with a 1 added to the end. Then I got multiple snaps. Since I was in class, I didn't open any of them. Later that day, however, my curiosity got the best of me, and I checked them. They were all pictures of me. Some were during lunch, others were of me walking home from school. Again, I forgot the screenshots and blocked the user. The next night, I got another snap from that same username, but with a 2 at the end. It was a picture of my window, taken from across the street. This time, I told my dad. He freaked out and called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. Unfortunately, I didn't get screenshots, so there wasn't much they could do. I think it was that couple from across the street, but since I can't prove it, I may never know. I live in a small farming community, about an hour outside of a major city in the Midwest. I won't say which one. We regularly have parties at my friend's property for the whole community. We usually have a giant fire. My friend's dad built a new barn last year, so we would burn what is left of the old one. The word has gotten around to some of the neighboring towns, and we often get outsiders come in to join. It's a great way to meet new people and chill with old friends. At one of these parties, I noticed a beautiful girl who I had never seen before. She was tall with long red hair and a flowing green dress. I'm normally very shy around girls, but I walked up to her anyway. "Hey, I'm Troy," I said. "Hey Troy, I'm Claire," she replied. Claire said that she was from a town only a few miles away. I had never heard of it. That might seem like a red flag, but I can be pretty bad with names of places, so it didn't bother me. We had a great conversation. She was really funny and charming. I was shocked she was even interested in me. As the fire died down later in the evening, the party died with it. Claire and I exchanged Snapchat usernames, and then parted ways. Laying in bed that evening, my mind was fixated on her. However, one thing did strike me as odd. It seemed like she had come alone. Like I said, it's not uncommon for outsiders to join in on the party. We even encourage it. However, They always come in groups. For a single girl to show up alone was strange. I didn't worry about it though, and I soon fell asleep. Over the coming weeks, Claire and I stayed in touch regularly through Snapchat, sending a few selfies per day with some clever messages. I'm super funny, and I always come up with great captions for my selfies. After some back and forth, we decided to meet again. She suggested a spot around one of the country roads where we could be alone. That sounded great to me. We decided that she would go first and use the snap map so I could find the location. My dad had an older truck that he allowed me to use, so I jumped in and set off. The sun was dipping below the horizon, but the bright headlights of the truck were more than enough to light the empty dirt road. Small shrubs and bushes dotted the landscape, with the occasional tree sticking out like a sore thumb. There was no sign of civilization, just empty fields. I looked at my phone to check Claire's location on the snap map. I was close. As I neared the spot, I noticed an old pickup truck stopped on the road. It was positioned sideways, blocking the entire road. I was confused at first, but what happened next left me terrified. Another set of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. They were trying to trap me. The space was closing in fast as I approached the truck ahead. I floored the gas and swerved off the road, attempting to go around the blockade. To my relief, I was able to get back on the road in one piece. I glanced into my rearview mirror as I sped away. Claire and an older man stood on the road glaring at me. When I arrived home, I told my dad about the incident. I was embarrassed, but I had caused some damage to the truck in my escape, so I had to come clean. He was sympathetic and contacted the police. Unfortunately, Claire had blocked me, and since I didn't save any of our conversations, there wasn't really any evidence. I figure they were planning to rob me, but it seemed like an overly elaborate plan for what would have amounted to an old pickup truck and whatever pocket change I had on me. Perhaps their plans were more sinister, but luckily, we will never know. My name is Penelope, and at the time of this incident, I was 16. I've always enjoyed board games, and I have a good group of friends that share my passion. We would always go to one of those board game cafes. This one was called Snakes and Lattes. They always have the cleverest names. I usually went with my friends, but it was not uncommon for us to meet people when we were there and get a big game going. One day, I was playing with a couple of friends, and a man came over to our group.
Hey girls, can I join?
He asked. Sure, I said. To be honest, I didn't want him to join us, but I was less confident back then, and had some real people-pleaser tendencies. I could tell that my friends didn't want him to join us either, which was clear from the look on their faces. He said his name was Dave, and he was 27 years old. He had long brown hair and thick glasses that were held together by a piece of tape wrapped around the middle part. Dave immediately started giving off bad vibes. He was sitting next to me, and all he did was complain about his girlfriend. He said that he came here to get away from her, and that the only reason he didn't dump her was because she was his only source of income and shelter. What am I supposed to say to that? I just gritted my teeth and nodded awkwardly. He also bragged about how he stole a large hunting knife from Walmart, and he showed it to me. Also, he told me that his glasses were broken from a bar fight. That really scared me. The kind of guy that carries a knife and gets into fights just has trouble written all over him. He did seem kind and friendly in a way, though, but he was casually talking about assaulting people. We were only about halfway through the game when he asked for my Snapchat. I reluctantly gave it to him. Like I said, I didn't have the courage to say no back then. If anyone tried that on me now, I would have had no problem laughing in his face. Just after I gave it to him, he got up and went to the bathroom. While he was away, I received a message from him on Snapchat. It read,
Hey, I know this sounds creepy, but I think we should totally date.
There was more written, but I didn't need to read it. I wrote back, "Oh, no, I'm not interested in a relationship right now." He replied with,
Okay, no problem.
When he came back, we acted like nothing happened. The rest of the game was one of the most awkward hours of my life. He made a few crude comments and attempts at flirting, but I quickly shut them down. After the game, I told my friends what happened with Dave. We agreed that he was a weird guy and that we would try to avoid him from now on. He sent me a few messages throughout the next week or two, but I ignored them. I have also seen him at the cafe since, but we always try to avoid him, and it's worked so far. This all started at the beginning of the semester a few years ago. I was a senior in high school, and I had a pretty good group of friends. We would often use Snapchat to stay in touch, or just to share memes or jokes. I was riding the bus home from school on a Friday, excited to start the weekend, when my phone buzzed. I had a new message on Snapchat. The username was just some random numbers and letters, and it had a picture of my school, with no message. I figured it was just one of my friends messing around, so I replied, "Haha, nice picture, loser," or something sarcastic like that. There was no reply after that. Later that evening, my friends and I met at a park near my house. We would often meet there and decide on something to do. We decided to go to my friend Tim's house, since his parents were away. As we walked there, I casually brought up the Snapchat message. I figured we could have a laugh about it. However, they all vehemently denied it. I didn't know what to believe. Maybe it was one of them, and they just thought it would be funny to mess with me. But I wasn't sure. We were watching a movie in Tim's living room when my phone lit up. It was another message from the mysterious account. This time, it was a picture of my house.
I'm coming for you,
is what the message said. This time, I knew it wasn't one of them because we were all in the same room, and I didn't see any of them with their phones. I showed the message to Tim. "Dude, that's messed up," he said. "Yeah, who do you think would do that?" I asked. "No idea. Must just be somebody messing around," he added. I thought Tim was probably right. It must have just been someone from school playing a joke on me. A bad joke, but a joke nonetheless. After the movie was over, I walked home. I was a little on edge knowing that my new Snapchat friend was out there, but I had a lot of courage, so it wasn't that big of a deal for me. While I was getting ready for bed, I got another message. This time, it was a picture of my bedroom window with the message,
Come outside.
I rushed to the window and peeked through the curtains. There was somebody standing on the front lawn, covered by a shroud of darkness. I couldn't see his face, but he was wearing a dark gray hoodie and ripped jeans with running shoes. He was holding a phone, but other than that, he didn't seem to have anything. No visible weapons. This time, I decided to ignore it. I didn't reply to the message. If this was a joke, I didn't want to give him the enjoyment of a reaction. Not able to sleep, I lay awake in bed, periodically checking my phone, expecting another message. After about 20 minutes, it happened. Another message from my stalker. This time the picture was of my front door with the message,
If you won't come out, then I'm coming in.
This had gone far enough. I took a screenshot of the image, and I was about to tell my parents so we could call the police. However, looking at the picture, I noticed something. I could see his reflection in the window of our front door. It was the younger brother of a friend of mine. His name was Alex. I hardly knew him, and we certainly didn't have any problems with each other. I replied, "I know it's you, Alex. Screw off." No reply. I didn't get any more messages for the rest of the weekend, and I didn't tell anybody what happened. On Monday, however, Alex came up to me after school, begging me not to tell anyone. He said it was just a joke that went too far. He also added in some other excuses for good measure. His girlfriend just broke up with him, he's failing math, his dog just died. Really piled it on for sympathy. I told him it was cool, but just don't do it again. Part of me felt sorry for him, so maybe his excuses worked. I sell a lot of things on Facebook Marketplace, and I also buy. Very few things have gone wrong for me, but I do have one terrible experience to share. This happened about 5 years ago, when I first moved into my apartment. I was sleeping on the floor for the first few weeks at this point. I had one of those foam camping pads that was actually pretty comfortable. I was ready for a real bed though, and I can never resist looking for a deal. I found an ad for a brand new mattress on Facebook. It was one of those compressed foam ones that expands when you take it out of the box, so I knew it was really new. I don't remember the actual price, but it was about a 20% discount from a new one. Not a bad deal. I sent him a message and didn't bother trying to bargain. We went back and forth a few times, discussing the details of the mattress and setting up a time to meet. I agreed to pick it up the next day. It was small enough to fit into the back of my tiny car. When the day came, I found myself driving to a part of town that I'd never been to before. I was fairly new to the city still, so that was true for most places. When I arrived at the apartment complex, I parked my car on the street and got out. I walked up to the front door and checked my phone to see if the seller had sent me a message. He had given me the apartment number, so I headed up the stairs. The apartment was on the second floor, at the end of the hallway. As I walked down the corridor, I could hear the sound of music blaring from behind the door. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened. The seller was a young man in his early 20s, with bloodshot red eyes and a twitchy demeanor. He looked like he had been up for days, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was on drugs.
Hey man,
He said, greeting me with a crooked smile.
come on in.
I followed him into the apartment. The place was a mess, with dirty clothes and empty bottles strewn about. The music was coming from a stereo in the corner, and it was so loud that I had to shout to be heard. The seller led me to a corner of the living room where the mattress was. I was surprised to see that there were 3 of them. That was a bit of a red flag, and I wondered why the guy had 3 brand new mattresses in his apartment. I could understand if he bought 1, then changed his mind, but 3? I was suspicious, and didn't want to buy something that was stolen. I asked the guy why he was selling, but he gave me some answer that made absolutely no sense. I can't even remember it. It was total nonsense. After that, I was pretty sure they were stolen somehow. You don't make money by buying brand new mattresses and selling them at a discount. I told him I would pass on the deal, and I headed for the door, but he stopped me. He started shouting and getting in my face. I was sure at this point that he was on drugs. I knew I had to get out of there, so I pushed past him and ran for the door. As I fumbled with the lock, I could hear the seller screaming at me, telling me that I was wasting his time and that he was going to call the cops on me. I actually chuckled under my breath when he said that. Call the cops for what? Not buying a stolen mattress? I finally managed to get the door open and ran down the hallway as fast as I could. I could hear the seller shouting and cursing behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running until I was out of that building and back in the fresh air. I got into my car and drove back home. I was glad I never gave that guy my address. I never called the cops because I didn't have any proof of anything, and what happened in that place would just be my word against his. Not surprisingly, he never called the cops on me either, but to be honest, I was kind of hoping he would, just for the laughs. I had a bad experience on Facebook Marketplace last year. After much deliberation, I had finally decided to sell my car. It was a tough decision to make, but I was moving to another state, and it just didn't make sense to bring it with me. I had posted the ad on Facebook with multiple pictures of the car, and within a few hours, I received an overwhelming number of offers. Most of them were ridiculously low, so I just ignored those ones. One of the offers caught my attention, and it was from a man named Stan. He had offered the full amount that I was asking for the car, which was quite surprising, considering that most of the other offers were far below what I was asking. We exchanged a few messages and agreed to meet for a test drive. We decided to meet at a parking lot that Stan had suggested. It was a bit out of the way for me, but I knew the area pretty well because it was close to my friend's place. The day of the test drive arrived. I was a little worried about meeting a stranger online, but I did it anyway. When I got to the parking lot, it was almost dark. I looked around nervously, waiting for Stan to arrive. After a few minutes, a pickup truck pulled up. Two men got out of the truck and walked up to my car. They were both around average height, and they both wore blue jeans. One of them had a black jacket, and the other one was wearing a white t-shirt, even though it was pretty cold out. It was dark, but the parking lot was well lit, even though we were the only ones there. I rolled down the window and started talking to them. "Hi, are you Stan?" I asked. The man with the black jacket nodded and said,
Yeah, that's me. You must be Ben. Nice to meet you.
I smiled weakly and got out of the car. I couldn't help but notice that the other man was just standing there, looking at me with a blank expression. I started to feel weird, but I tried to shake it off and stop worrying. We walked around the car, and Stan started asking me questions about it. He seemed genuinely interested, and I started to relax a bit. We got into the car, and he started the engine. As we drove around the parking lot, I noticed that Stan was driving quite aggressively. He was taking sharp turns and driving at a high speed. I didn't actually mind though. Maybe if we were on the road, then I would have been kinda scared. After a few minutes, Stan suddenly stopped the car and turned off the engine. He turned to me and said,
You know, I'm not sure if I want to buy this car after all. It's not really what I'm looking for.
I was a little disappointed, but no big deal. I was hoping that this would be the sale I needed to get rid of the car before I moved. But then it seemed like a waste of time. I got out of the car and headed back over to the driver's seat. When I approached the door, both men were standing there blocking it. I stood in front of them awkwardly for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. That was when the other man pulled something out of his pocket. I thought it was a knife at first, but I think it was some kind of an ice pick. It was a long, sharp metal thing anyway. I don't know what it was, but he pointed it at me and told me to get away from the car. Then he demanded my phone. I fumbled in my pockets and managed to pull out my phone. I handed it over to one of them. I don't remember which one. One of them got into my car, and the other got into the truck. They both drove away together. As they were leaving, I tried to check the license plate of the truck, but it was covered. I knew I fell for one of the oldest tricks in the book, and I felt really stupid. Luckily, I still have my wallet. I don't know why they didn't take that too, but I'm not complaining. I walked to the nearest bus stop and managed to get home within an hour. I called the police from my laptop when I got home. Not surprisingly, Stan's Facebook profile was gone already, and I didn't get the truck's license plate. The police tried to help, but there was not much they could do. As the days went by, I started to feel angry. Angry at the men who had stolen my car, and angry at myself for being so naive. I couldn't believe that something like this could happen to me. I bought my first rental property a few years ago. I was planning to turn it into an Airbnb, and I was constantly looking for cheap ways to furnish the place. I still needed a bunch of stuff, including a refrigerator and some other appliances. One day, I came across a promising listing on Facebook Marketplace. It was a sleek and modern fridge, and it looked like it would fit perfectly into the kitchen. I sent a message to the seller, hoping to secure the deal before anyone else could take it. Then I put my computer away for a few hours. When I opened it again, the seller had responded with an address and a time to meet. They seemed eager to get rid of the fridge, and I was equally eager to make the purchase. The price was fair, so I didn't waste any time trying to bargain for a few bucks. I loaded up my truck and headed out. while I was still in my driveway, I put the location into my GPS. It was a spot that was out of the city, in a mostly forested part. I sort of knew the area, because I had gone out there a few times to do some hiking. As I drove down the winding country road, a worry didn't cross my mind. I had made many deals on Facebook and Craigslist before, and never had a problem. There were trees on both sides of the road, and the occasional house. The further I went, the more remote the area became. Eventually, I got there, and I pulled up in front of the address that the seller had given me. At first glance, the house looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and there was no sign of life inside. I almost turned around right there, but I decided to check it out anyway. I knocked on the door, but not surprisingly, there was no answer. I checked my phone to see if I could message the seller, but when I pulled up the conversation, I saw that the profile was gone. That's when I realized that something was up. I scanned the area, trying to spot any signs of life. I turned around and saw 3 large men standing in front of my truck. They looked intimidating, with their arms crossed and scowls on their faces. I tried to make my way back to the truck, but they stepped forward, blocking my path. Their faces were blank, as though they were trying to intimidate me. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal. The men continued to stare at me, not saying a word. No words needed to be said. I knew what this was, and I knew why they were here. They never pulled a weapon on me, but I'm pretty sure they would have if it came to that. I turned and ran past the house and into the woods. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I was already on the phone with the police at that point. The driver took one look at me and could tell something was wrong. I explained what happened, and he agreed to drop me off at a gas station, where I could wait for the police. I was waiting in front of the gas station for 10 minutes or so when the police arrived. They already knew what happened mostly. I told my story to the operator over the phone. We went to the spot where the house was. When we arrived, my truck was gone. I had obviously fallen into a trap. There was no refrigerator, and the men probably didn't even own that house. On closer inspection, it was definitely abandoned. The officers told me that they would continue to investigate, but there was a good chance that my truck was already being stripped for parts. They also told me that this scam is more common than most people think, and there was little hope that the guys would be caught. I used to use Facebook Marketplace all the time, mostly for buying, but occasionally selling. This story is about a really scary guy who I met on there. I had just purchased a brand new 4K TV, and I wanted to sell my old one to cover some of the cost. After posting a few photos and a description of the TV, I received a message from a potential buyer named Perry. It was only up there for an hour or two before he messaged me. He was interested in buying the TV, and asked me a few questions about its condition and functionality. It was in perfect condition, and 2 or 3 years old. I was asking around half the price of a new one, and they were still selling a really similar model, so I thought that was a fair deal. He tried to negotiate a bit, but I was firm. I didn't blame him for trying, and I came down a few bucks just so he could feel like he won. I gave him my address, and we agreed that he would come and pick it up the following evening. The evening came and went, but Perry never showed up. He never sent me a message or anything. He just didn't show. Before bed that night, I opened my messages and found another offer for the TV. I thought it was fair to give somebody else a chance. I made a deal with someone else, and he came to pick up the TV the next morning. I had all but forgotten about Perry at this point. Later that day, I got a new message from Perry. He wanted to reschedule and pick up the TV another time. I told him it was already sold. He then sent me a series of angry messages. He accused me of lying to him and claimed that I sold it to someone else while stringing him along. That was really crazy. I explained to him that I waited for him to show up, but he didn't, so I sold it to someone else. But Perry wasn't having any of it. He continued to send me angry messages and accuse me of being dishonest and scamming him. I don't really think he knew what a scam was. I decided to ignore Perry's messages and hoped he would calm down and move on. But that's not what happened. The only thing that worried me was that I gave him my address. I was worried that he would show up, and that's exactly what happened. Later that night, I heard a loud banging at my front door. I tiptoed over to it and peeked through the peephole. To my horror, I saw a man standing outside. It was hard to tell from his Facebook picture, but I'm pretty sure it was Perry. I stood there behind the door, not knowing what to do. He continued to bang on the door and shout obscenities. I could hear the anger in his voice, and I feared for my life. It was really uncomfortable, but after 20 or 30 minutes, Perry took off. I couldn't believe he stood on my porch for that long. I considered calling the cops, but I didn't think it was that serious at the time. He was an older guy, and I knew I could handle him if it came to that. I didn't think it would, but I wasn't worried just in case. Nothing happened for a while, and I thought it was all over, but it wasn't. The next week, I noticed a black sedan parked outside my house, and there was a man sitting in the front seat. I noticed it when I got home from work at around 6 p.m., and it was still there at 8. Then I looked closer. I recognized him. It was Perry. He was sitting in the car, watching my house. I decided to call the police, just to be safe. Like I said, I thought I could defend myself, but there's no telling what kind of weapons he could have. And if he broke into my house in the middle of the night, he could catch me off guard. The police arrived quickly and approached Perry's car. They spoke to him for a few minutes before letting him go with a warning. They told him not to come back to my house and to leave me alone. I never saw Perry again after that night. I still don't know what he was planning, if anything. Who has the time to stake out a stranger's house all night over a used TV? I guess he didn't have anything else to do. He didn't have a TV after all. I've been working for a large tech company since I graduated from college. That was almost 10 years ago, so I've become one of the more senior employees at my company. I was especially important because the company had grown so much since I'd been there. It was publicly listed a few years ago, and its value is in the billions now. A big leap from the tiny startup it was when I joined. At the time of this incident, I was managing a project with a partner of ours that's based in Germany. Because of that, I would be in and out of Zoom calls frequently throughout the day. We would usually schedule calls for my early morning, since that would be the same as their afternoon. But sometimes things would come up and I would have to join a call in the middle of the night. Or they would have to stay up late and deal with something in the afternoon. I really enjoyed the project overall, but I don't speak German, so it was difficult at times. Germans tend to speak English really well though, so that's how we made it work. Dennis was one of my colleagues on the German side. We had never met in person, but we spoke almost every day, so it felt like we had become friends. He was a very calm and level-headed guy. I don't think I ever heard him raise his voice in the 6 months that we've been working together. That's impressive, because there were at least a few stressful situations that we dealt with in that time. We were on a call one afternoon with me, Dennis, and 3 others. Dennis was the only German among us. It was my afternoon, so it would have been 9 or 10 p.m. for Dennis. We were about halfway through the meeting when I heard a loud pounding noise coming from my computer speakers. I was watching Dennis at the time, and when I heard that noise, he turned and looked behind him, a nervous look on his face. Then he got up and walked out of the room. I heard his door open. After that, all I heard was talking in German. I have no idea what they were saying, but it sounded unfriendly. It soon escalated to yelling. Not long after that, I heard 3 gunshots. It all happened so fast. Then, just in view of camera, I saw a man walk by, and it wasn't Dennis. He was out of focus, and it was far away, so I couldn't tell much about his appearance, but I know what Dennis looked like, and that wasn't him. My other colleagues and I talked about it for a few minutes after we calmed down. We decided that we had to do something, but none of us even knew how to call the police in Germany. We ended up calling one of our other colleagues from the German office and had him call for the emergency. After that, we ended the Zoom call and waited. I don't know for sure what happened that day, because it's not a topic that anybody likes to discuss. But one thing I can tell you is that Dennis never came back to work, and the rumor is that he was killed that day. If I had to guess, Dennis had some kind of enemy, which would explain the concerned look on his face when he heard the initial knock. Then when he answered it, the guy shot him. One of Dennis's colleagues from the German office took over for him, and we all moved on. It's pretty sad how we were able to just replace him like that. He was a human being after all. But life must go on, I guess. After I graduated from college, my best friend Sarah and I took jobs in different cities. We were very close during our time at school, and we put the effort into maintaining our friendship. Part of this involved at least 2 Zoom calls per week. It's not the same as an in-person friendship, but sometimes you just have to work with what you have. I actually moved back to my hometown, and I was living with my parents at the time until I found my own place. Sarah, on the other hand, moved to a large city where rent is through the roof, so she rented a room in a shared house with 2 others. Her house was a small single-floor bungalow just outside the downtown core. She took me on a tour once through a Zoom call and showed me the whole place, so I basically knew my way around just from that. It was an older place. It actually reminded me of one of the houses that I'd lived in during my time at college. The appliances were old, dents in the walls, and dirty floors. I didn't meet any of her roommates though, because they were either not around or they were in their rooms during our calls that we'd had so far. She did tell me about them though, and they seemed really cool, so I was excited to say hi at some point. We were on a call one Saturday evening. It was about 10 p.m. for me, and Sarah was in a different time zone, so it would have been 11 for her. We had been talking for 15 or 20 minutes, just about random things and how work was going. Nothing too deep. Sarah's camera was facing her bedroom door, which was open, so I could just barely see some of the hallway outside her room. It was out of focus though. Suddenly, I saw a dark figure walk past behind her. It looked really creepy, like it was from a horror film or something. I wasn't actually worried though, because I figured it was just one of her roommates. I didn't say anything about it at the moment, because Sarah was in the middle of a story. When there was a break in the conversation, I asked Sarah if I could meet her roommate. She told me that neither of them were home. I looked at her confused, then I told her that I'd seen somebody walk by a few minutes ago. She turned and looked out the hallway, then looked back, visibly scared. Sarah always wore a headset when we talked because her laptop speakers were really quiet, so she wouldn't have heard anybody come in. I told her that somebody must have come in while we were talking, and she didn't notice. She said that was not possible because both her roommates were going to be away all weekend. That's when I realized that something was wrong. Whoever walked by before was someone else. Someone who shouldn't be there. Sarah got up, grabbed her phone, and immediately left the house. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart beating out of my chest. She didn't bother to close the call, so I stayed watching the screen. I was hoping that I'd been mistaken before, but I wasn't. After a minute or two, the same dark figure appeared again. This time, he stopped at the doorway and walked into the room. He was a tall man, wearing all black. His face was covered with some kind of black mask. Maybe it was just a black t-shirt tied around his head. I yelled at him, but he couldn't hear me because the headset was still plugged in, so the speakers were not working. He slowly walked towards the computer and ended the call. I sat there stunned and quickly dialed Sarah's phone. She answered on the first ring. I could tell from her voice that she was crying. She told me that the police were already there and that they were currently checking out the house. I stayed on the line with her until the police called her over. She called me later and filled me in on what happened. When the police searched the house, They found the man trying to escape out the back, but they caught him. My guess is that when he saw me on the screen, he must have realized that he was caught and tried to escape. I like to think that he was just trying to rob the place, but that seems far from certain. Who knows what would have happened if I didn't notice him walk by that door. I was a teaching assistant in college during my last year of my master's degree. It was a first-year philosophy class, and there were hundreds of students. The lectures took place in the largest auditorium on campus. Well, they usually did, but this story takes place when the quarantine rules were at their peak, so it was actually online. In addition to the main lecture, the students were split up into study groups with a teaching assistant assigned to each. I was one of those teaching assistants. My group was made up of 10 students. This group was important because you can't really learn about philosophy without being able to discuss the topics in an intimate setting. That simply isn't possible with the full class. As important as I feel it was, attendance at my group was pretty mediocre. Of my 10 students, only about half would show up on any given day. It took place on Zoom, of course, since in-person meetings were banned at my school at the time. One day I joined my study group, and I was pleased to see that there were 7 students present. Better than average turnout for me. We went about our meeting as usual. I won't go into too much detail about that, because it doesn't have anything to do with the story. After about 10 minutes, another student joined, but when I looked at him, he was completely unfamiliar. I stared at the guy for several seconds. It looked like he didn't even realize he was on camera. Also, his name was displayed on the screen. It said that it was Benjamin, one of my students. However, Benjamin showed up most of the time, and I knew him, and that was not Benjamin. As soon as I realized that, the guy disappeared. That was incredibly suspicious, so I decided to end the lesson for the day. I was going to send an email to Benjamin and let him know what I saw, but when I opened my account, there was already a new email from him. He said that someone had broken into his apartment and stole his computer while he was sleeping, and that's why he couldn't join the call. The guy on the call must have been the thief. He probably clicked the Zoom link by accident. It's pretty creepy to think that I saw that guy on camera who had broken into my student's apartment. Unfortunately, he was never caught, and Benjamin never got his laptop back. If only I had taken a screenshot when that guy was on camera, then maybe the story would have a happier ending. But I didn't, and that's how it ends. Back when the quarantine rules were in effect, my high school moved to completely online. Even though I was staying home all day, my parents still had to go to work. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a truck driver, so they were both considered essential workers. Because of that, I was home all day alone. It wasn't a big deal though, because I was in the 10th grade and I could handle myself. Like I said, school had moved online, so all my classes were done through Zoom. I was in my English class when this happened. That was my favorite class of the day, not because of the class itself, but because my friend Lawrence was in it as well. He and I would always send funny messages back and forth throughout the boring lecture from our teacher. I set up my laptop in the kitchen. There was a large window behind me that overlooked the backyard, which was fenced in. The yard backed onto a small forest, which was really thick with trees and bushes, so anyone who looked at me on Zoom would see that as my background. The class had been going on for about a half hour. Lawrence and I were goofing off as usual. At some point, he sent me a message saying that he saw someone walk by behind me. I didn't believe him because it seemed like the kind of joke that he might tell just to scare me. But I turned around anyway, just to be sure, and there was nobody there. I replied to him with, "Nice try, loser," or something like that. He was really persistent though, and insisted that he'd seen someone back there. That was when I became concerned. Lawrence liked to joke around, but he didn't hold on to a joke for too long. If I called him out on his BS, he would usually admit it right away, and we would have a laugh. So I got up and looked out the window, but there was still nobody there. At this point, I was feeling pretty creeped out. Our teacher had just announced a 10-minute break, so I decided to check it out in order to ease my mind. I got up from my chair and went out to the backyard of my house. I put on my dad's flip-flops and took a quick walk around the backyard. I walked from one end to the other, then I walked to the end of the yard where our lawn meets the forest. I looked around in the thick bush for a minute or two, not that it did much good, since you could only see a few feet in either direction there. After that, I was satisfied that nobody was there. If Lawrence did see somebody, then maybe it was just one of my neighbors cutting through for whatever reason. The break was almost over, so I turned around and walked back to the house. When I looked at the house, I noticed that the door was still open. I was pretty sure that I'd closed it when I went out, so I was concerned. I kept walking back towards the house, and when I got there, I stood in the doorway and looked around. I noticed a few dirty footprints on the floor in front of me, and I'm sure that they were not there before. Somebody was in the house. I was about to bolt out of there when I realized that I'd left my phone on the table next to my laptop. So before I left, I darted into the kitchen, grabbed my phone, then sprinted out of that place. When I was a few houses down the street, I called 911. The police arrived soon after, and not long after that, I saw them taking a man out of my house in handcuffs. One of the officers told me that he was found hiding in the closet of one of the bedrooms upstairs. Based on their description, it was either my room or the spare room that we have for guests. Either way, it was a super creepy experience, even though it could have ended much worse. A few years ago, a weird thing happened to me and my friends. I, like most kids my age, was a big user of social media. It was a really important part of our lives. There was really no way to get away from it. One evening, as I was mindlessly swiping through the Facebook app, a new notification caught my eye. It was a direct message from an unfamiliar username, simply stating, "I've been watching you." I hesitated for a moment before deciding to open the message. I assumed it was a joke and thought it was probably one of my friends. When I checked the profile, there was really nothing there. No picture, no posts, nothing. I didn't reply to the message, just in case it was a real creep. I just ignored it. The next day, when I was at school, I was on my phone between classes, and I got another message from the strange profile. This time it was a picture of my parents' house. I dropped my phone to the ground and pretty much freaked out. I didn't know where to turn, so I went to my friend Laura and showed it to her. She was as shocked as me, but she didn't know what to do either. I was pretty sure I had a stalker, so I went to the teacher in my next class and told her what happened. Within a few minutes, I was in the principal's office, and minutes later, the police were there. Part of me thought they were overreacting, but I guess that kind of thing can be pretty serious. I did an interview with one of the cops, and then I was sent back to class. I had to let them keep my phone, though. The next few days without my phone were tough, but I knew it was better than having a stalker. After another 2 days, my parents told me what happened. The police tracked the account of my stalker and found the identity behind it. It turned out that the messages were sent by my friend Andrea's mom. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know her that well, but there was certainly no animosity between us. There was just no way to explain what she did. The police didn't press charges, but the next day, Andrea and her mom came over to my house to apologize. Believe me when I say that it was by far the most awkward thing that I've ever experienced. I watched a 40-something-year-old cry, begging for forgiveness for sending creepy stalker messages to me. I told her it was okay. I just wanted it to be over. I don't think she was a real danger to me, but it was really creepy nonetheless. From that day on, I kept my distance from Andrea and her family. We were friends, but not really good friends, so it wasn't that hard. I still remember this night like it was yesterday, even though it was almost 15 years ago. My name is Jenna, and I was an active Facebook user in the early days of social media. It was a time when we were all still navigating the dangers of connecting with strangers online. I was one of the last of my friends to start using it, but I was still relatively early, compared to the current generation anyway. One evening, I was scrolling through my Facebook feed, and I noticed a request from someone named Marcus. I didn't recognize the name or the profile picture, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to accept. I think it was more common back then to connect with random strangers, or maybe I was just more naive. Within minutes, Marcus started messaging me, striking up a conversation as if we were old friends. It was strange, considering we had never interacted before. At first, I thought he might have mistaken me for someone else, but when I brought that up, it seemed not to be the case. There was something about his words that intrigued me. He seemed to know things about me, personal details that I had never shared on Facebook. I was a little creeped out at first, but I had a public profile, and I didn't remember everything that I had shared or deleted since I had been posting, so it was possible that it was nothing. For example, though, he knew my last name even though I didn't have it on my profile. As the days went on, Marcus's messages became more frequent and intense. He started commenting on my photos, sometimes multiple comments on each. I felt that things had gotten out of control, and I wanted to end things. One night, while I was alone at home, I received a message from Marcus that sent shivers down my spine. It read,
I know your deepest secrets, Jenna. I've been watching you closely.
Fear gripped me as I looked around my dimly lit room, half expecting to see his shadow lurking in the corners. I didn't reply to the messages. I just closed my computer and didn't turn it on until the next day. When I checked again, there was a message from Marcus claiming that he was joking. I didn't believe him, though. I was terrified, and I wanted nothing to do with him. I decided to confide in my best friend Ash. When I told her about Marcus and his messages, she turned pale. She told me that she had seen some random friend requests too, but she declined them all. I felt so stupid that I had gotten involved with a creepy stranger from the internet. Marcus's messages became more threatening. He began mentioning specific locations where I had been, even those I had never disclosed online. Paranoia consumed me, and I was constantly looking over my shoulders. I didn't know if he was following me in real life, or if he was just able to find those things out by cyber stalking. I hoped it was the latter, but I couldn't be sure. Unable to bear the torment any longer, I finally contacted the police. I provided them with all the evidence I had gathered, hoping they could trace Marcus's online activities and make him stop. Then one day, I received a call from the cops. They told me that they had managed to track down Marcus and apprehend him. He was in my state but a different town, so it's very possible that he was stalking me for real. The danger was worse than I thought. It turned out he was a disturbed individual who had been stalking multiple people through social media. Even to this day, the memory of Marcus and what happened scares me. I've learned a lot about online safety since then, and I never talk to strangers like I used to. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace, looking for a second-hand bicycle. My old one was too small, and it was also in pretty rough shape. Rusty gears and a deformed drivetrain. It wasn't even worth fixing up. Living in a big city, I found it convenient to browse through online listings to find a good deal. There are always new items being posted. Every day it's different. That's when I came across an ad for a high-quality bike, posted by a user named Max. The bike looked fantastic in the pictures, and the price seemed too good to pass up. Max wanted a little over half the new price, but it was 3 years old, so it was a good deal, but not suspicious. I messaged him to ask about the bike. He responded promptly, suggesting we meet at a local park to check it out, so I could possibly buy it. We agreed to meet on Sunday afternoon at the park. It was about a half-hour bus ride from my place. I was planning to ride it home if all went well. When I arrived, I noticed a tall, athletic-looking man, presumably Max, waiting near a bench. There was no bike though, I approached him anyway. I knew it was him because I checked out his Facebook profile. He greeted me with a smile, and we began discussing the bike, even though it wasn't there. He seemed knowledgeable and passionate about cycling, sharing stories of his adventures on the trails. One thing was wrong though, obviously. Where was the bike? I couldn't understand. As soon as I asked, he told me that we had to go to his place to pick it up. That set off alarm bells, because I couldn't understand why he wouldn't bring it. I was thinking that I would try it out at the park, and we would make the deal right then and there. I didn't want to go to some stranger's house if I didn't need to. There was no reason for it. I naively agreed to go with him, though. Max told me that his place was just 5 minutes away, so we started walking. After about 10 minutes, we still weren't there. I turned to Max and asked if we were close. He seemed annoyed and snapped at me. He started yelling at me out of nowhere. I was standing on the sidewalk in the middle of the day, and a grown man was throwing a fit, screaming in my face. I had no idea what set him off, but he seemed to think I was wasting his time. The guy was clearly unstable, and I was too scared to go to his place. I didn't care how good a deal it was. I turned around and started walking away. I didn't want to look back, but I did anyway. He was running after me, still seething with anger. When I saw that, I burst into a run as well. I soon made it to a busier street, and I was able to get away from him. I wish that was the end of it, but it wasn't. When I got home, I opened my laptop and found a pile of messages from Max. The first was apologetic, but then they became threatening. It was weird because the threatening ones came minutes after the ones that were apologizing. I didn't reply to any of them, and just blocked the profile, and I tried to move on. I kept using Facebook Marketplace after that. Another time I was browsing, and I saw an ad for another bike. I was still looking to buy, so I messaged the seller. His name was John. We agreed to meet at a different park, closer to my place. I arrived a little early, and stood at the front waiting near the street. Out of nowhere, I was shoved from behind. I stumbled and scraped my knee on the ground. When I turned around to look, it was Max from before. I was confused for a split second before I realized that I had been set up. Max created a fake profile to lure me into meeting him again. That guy was a serious psycho. I got up and ran away. This time I called the police and reported the whole thing. I should have done that the first time. When the cops arrived, they talked to both of us. My impression was that they could tell Max was crazy right away. He was arrested for shoving me, since he even admitted it to the cops. Fortunately, that was the last I saw or heard from him. It's only been about a month though, so I'm still not sure if it's over yet. It was scary to think that there was a guy out there plotting against me. I'll never feel safe meeting someone from Facebook again, especially for a bike. I'm not falling for that one again. This happened to me when I was in high school, which was around 10 years ago. One day as I was sat in front of the TV, I received a friend request on Facebook. Without much thought, I accepted it, not bothering to check the profile of who added me. I had my profile open to anybody back then, but I never really posted anything, so I thought it was fine. A few days passed, and I completely forgot about the friend request until a message popped up in my inbox. It was from the person who added me. He introduced himself as Ray, and he mentioned that we had a few friends in common. I replied, engaging in small talk. I didn't really question it, because I had some friends from other schools, and it was completely possible that we met at a party, or a concert, or something. I didn't want to be rude if that was the case. Ray seemed friendly and easy to talk to, and our conversation started becoming more frequent. We talked about music, school, and other stuff. Over time, I began to consider Ray as a friend. I would occasionally bring up our supposed mutual friends, but every time I did, Ray would change the subject. Looking back, I know that was suspicious. Nevertheless, we continued talking. Ray brought up the idea that we should meet. I was hesitant, but when he told me that my friend Josh was going to be there too, that put my mind at ease, and I agreed to go. We decided to meet at our school and just hang out and smoke. It was a place familiar to both of us, or so I thought. I arrived at the school in the late evening. It was around 11 p.m. As I walked through the deserted campus, the absence of other people gave the surroundings an eerie vibe. The dimly lit pathways were creepy. Even though my friends and I would meet there often, it was still weird at night. Some parts were well lit at all hours, but we decided to meet in a dark corner near the parking lot in order to avoid being caught. We were technically not supposed to be there. I looked around searching for any signs of Ray or Josh, but I couldn't find anybody. I could hear the sound of the road in the distance, and the occasional car's headlights shone in my eyes, causing me to squint. Suddenly, a man emerged from the darkness. He wore a hood that obscured his face, and also sunglasses, even though it was dark. He introduced himself as Ray, and as he approached, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about the situation. Ray's presence felt different than what I had imagined. His demeanor seemed distant and guarded, a stark contrast to the warmth and openness in our online interactions. He seemed older. Even though I couldn't see his face, I could sense that he was at least 30 or 35. It was weird, and even more concerning was that he was alone. Josh wasn't there like he promised. Doubts and concerns flooded my mind, but I didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Trying to put aside my reservations, I engaged in conversation, hoping to break the ice and create a more comfortable atmosphere. However, as soon as I heard Ray's voice, I knew he was way too old. His voice was raspy and deep, like a 50-year-old chain smoker. I was too afraid to even ask where Josh was. I thought that might set him off. I didn't want him to know that I was suspicious. Deep down, an instinctual alarm went off, urging me to leave. I made up an excuse claiming that something urgent had come up, and I needed to go. As I started walking away, Ray followed me for a short distance. Thankfully, after a few moments, he seemed to give up. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding as I made my way home. It became clear that the person I had been communicating with as Ray was not who he claimed to be. Once I reached the safety of my home, I reflected on this incident. I realized how fortunate I was to get away, but also how stupid I was for falling for it in the first place. All I had to do was call Josh to see if he knew that guy. I didn't even do that. It was beyond naive, and it could have cost me my life. The next day at school, I told some of my friends what happened. Not surprisingly, none of them had heard of Ray, Josh included. When I checked Facebook again, his profile was gone. I still have no idea who that guy was, or what he would have done to me if I didn't leave. I'm a 36-year-old guy, and I live by myself in a small town near a larger city. I have my own house that's small, but in a good neighborhood with a lot of outdoor space. I have a large yard that backs onto a wooded area. When I moved in, the previous owner left some things that I didn't want. There was a big dresser and some other furniture, table and chairs. I already had my own stuff though, so I left it in the basement for a while. Eventually I decided to put the stuff up for sale on Facebook. It was just one ad for all of it. I set my prices low because I wanted to get rid of everything. I didn't think it was worth very much anyway. I posted the ad on a Saturday afternoon, and by the next week, there were still no responses. I didn't worry about it, because there was a lot of storage space in my basement, and I wasn't using it for anything else. A few days later, on Monday or Tuesday, I finally got a response from someone. His name was Adam, but surprisingly, he didn't ask me anything about the furniture. His messages were strange. It was like he thought we were friends. The first thing he said was, "Hey man, what's up?" "Good. You interested in anything?" I replied. "I'm just hanging out tonight. How about you?" he wrote. I was confused and kind of thought he was messing with me and wasting my time. I didn't reply after that, but I didn't bother blocking him either since nothing really happened. That was the last thing I saw that day. The next morning, I opened my laptop to check Facebook before work. There was a pile of new messages from Adam. I scanned through them and read a few. The first one I read was an outright threat to my life. I read a few others, and they were all similar. After that, I blocked the account and reported it to Facebook. They sent me an email and told me his account had been removed. I don't think that's the most useful thing, because it's easy enough to create another account. Can't hurt though. After that, I was ready to move on. Like I said, I'm a 36-year-old guy, so I didn't feel particularly worried. People say all kinds of weird things on the internet. That doesn't make it okay by any means, but I didn't feel that any of the threats were credible. Since I didn't get any other responses, I posted the ad with even lower prices and better pictures. At this point, I might as well have made them free, but I decided to still try to get a few bucks out of it for my trouble. If that didn't work, then I would have put them up for free. This time around, I started to get a lot more responses. I don't know if it was something to do with the algorithm or the lower prices, but there was a lot more interest this time. Some people came by to get several of the items. By the end of the week, the only thing that was left was that big dresser that I mentioned earlier. As luck would have it, I got a message on Friday evening from somebody who wanted it. By then, I had knocked down the price all the way to $20. The profile said the guy's name was Ren, like from Ren and Stimpy. I was staying in that night, and Ren wanted to pick it up as soon as possible. I told him that I was around, and we agreed that he would come by at 8 p.m. I gave him my address so he could look it up. Next, I went to the basement to try to carry the dresser up the stairs. I wanted to have it ready for him, but the thing was way too heavy and awkward. I couldn't carry it up the stairs on my own. That was unfortunate, because I really didn't want to be alone with that stranger in my house. I decided to take the risk, though. At 8 o'clock, I looked out my front window and saw a dark van pull up to my house. It stopped on my driveway, and a man got out. He was around my age, or maybe a little older. He was bald, and he was a tall, thin guy with a serious look on his face. I went out and greeted him, then led him down to the basement where the dresser was waiting. As we walked down the stairs, I felt a chill. It seemed wrong to be alone down there with a perfect stranger. When we got to the dresser, he took a quick look at it, and turned around to me and said,
Looks good.
We lifted it up together and walked over to the stairs. He went on the upside, and I was down. When he was around the top of the stairs, I was still a little over halfway up. Suddenly, he stopped. I stood there holding the heavy dresser, cringing at the uncomfortable position that I was in. I looked up at Ren, and there was a chilling look on his face. I knew right there that I was in trouble. A fraction of a second later, he shoved the dresser down the stairs on top of me. I fell onto my back on the carpeted floor below. The corner of the dresser missed my hip by inches. It didn't crush me on the way down, but it did fall on me afterwards. I wasn't hurt badly, but I was trapped. I knew right then that he did it on purpose. I couldn't see up to where he was, but I could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps coming down towards me. With only seconds to act, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The man was closing in. If he got my phone, then I would be screwed. Just in time, 911 answered, and I told them my address, that it was an emergency. And I screamed at the guy that the police were coming. I told him to get out of there while he could. Laying on my back, the dresser was blocking my view of the man, but when I screamed, I heard him turn around and walk away quickly. Once he was gone, I managed to squirm out from under the dresser. I went up the stairs and saw police cars pulling up to my house. We discussed the incident for about half an hour. The officers asked me all kinds of questions, hoping for a lead. That was when I remembered the creeper that messaged me before. I was not able to give them details on him because the account had been deleted. You'd think the police would be able to recover it with help from Facebook, and I don't know if that ever happened or not. The next day, I found out that Ren was caught. Strangely, it turned out that Ren was actually his real name. He was given some pretty serious charges for what he did to me. They told me that he pleaded down from aggravated assault, and that he got a few years behind bars. As for the creep who messaged me before, we never found out if it was the same guy, but for some reason, I really believe that it was. What are the chances that someone threatens you online, and then someone else shows up and actually does it? Seems really unlikely to me. It must have been him. This happened a few months ago. Me and my friend, who we'll call Ryan, were very bored because it was the weekend and we didn't have school. We're both guys, and we tried everything we could think of, but we were still bored. I then mentioned to Ryan that we should go play games at a local arcade and just hang out. But then he mentioned that the closest arcade, where we usually went, was shut down for some kind of health issue, so we couldn't go there. Why don't we just go find a new spot? I said. Ryan looked at me like I had lost my mind, but after a few minutes of begging him, he agreed with me. We both hopped into Ryan's car. He was 19 at the time and could already drive. We drove around for a few minutes until I pointed out an arcade that looked brand new. Ryan then pulled into the parking lot, and we stopped. I got out of the car. I looked around the parking lot and noticed there were a good number of other cars there. Seems popular, I heard Ryan say as he walked next to me. Then we both headed inside, and when I got in, I almost slapped my hands over my ears. The music in that place was so loud that I could feel it shaking in my feet. I wasn't going to complain though, so we both headed up to the front desk and bought the things we needed to play their games. After a minute, we found a table where we could rest in case we got tired of walking around and looking for games to play. We ordered some soda and started chatting. I don't remember everything Ryan said because the place was so loud, but eventually we went and decided to play some games, and then I watched him walk off. I then decided to go off in my own direction. I found a few games to play. Most of the ones that I played were those shooting games, or the ones where you race cars. Then I found a basketball shooting game and decided to try that one out. I did what I needed to do to start playing, then I threw some basketballs like I was a pro. After the game ended, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I expected it to be Ryan, but when I turned, it wasn't. It was some random guy who looked around 5 years older than me, and I was 18. Something about him seemed off. He was wearing a black beanie, so I couldn't see his hair, but I noticed his eyes were blue. I then noticed that he was wearing a black shirt and blue jeans, and that he had tennis shoes on.
You play very well,
the guy said. He pointed at the basketball game, and I told him thank you with a nervous grin on my face. For some reason, the guy was making my danger radar go bonkers. I looked him over once again. He didn't look like he was drunk, and he didn't smell like drugs, but sometimes it doesn't matter. Then I noticed that he'd put his hand on my shoulder. I heard him say whoops before taking it off. Before he could say anything else, I walked away. I looked over my shoulder and noticed that the guy was just standing there, looking at me. I headed back to the table that Ryan had picked out, but I noticed Ryan was still gone. As I was taking sips from my drink, I kept looking around, expecting to see the guy jump out from behind me. A while later, I noticed Ryan walking over to the table. I noticed that his behavior looked different too. He kept looking over his shoulder while he was walking, and he was rubbing his arm, which he does when he's nervous about something. When he sat down on the other side of the table, I noticed that he looked pale, and his eyes seemed to be full of fear. I asked him what happened, and at first, he didn't tell me anything. But then when I asked again, he decided to tell me. He told me that while he was playing the claw machine game, a guy wearing a black beanie walked over to him. At first, the two just started talking about something to each other, but then it got more creepy for Ryan. He told me that the guy touched his hand in a sort of creepy way by rubbing it, and when Ryan asked him to stop, he just winked. Then Ryan noticed that the guy was trying to reach into his pocket. At that point, Ryan said that he had to run off. I gasped, asking Ryan a few things, and then I told him the same man came up to me and started talking weirdly to me also. After that, we decided to leave, and without looking back, we headed back to our car. Before we could drive off, my phone beeped. I looked at Ryan confused before pulling it out. I noticed that it was a Facebook message. I was really new to Facebook, and I had only been on it for a few weeks. When I looked at the message, I nearly dropped my phone to the ground of the car, and Ryan asked me what happened.
Hey, you two. Why didn't you say goodbye before you left?
The message read. Ryan's mouth fell open, and then he asked me who it was. I said I didn't know. I then texted the person and asked who they were and what they wanted. Instead of answering my question, they sent an image. A picture showed up, and it was of the front of Ryan's car. We could even see the shadows of me and Ryan sitting in the car. I then told the person that if they did anything stupid, I was going to call the police. Ryan and I then drove away. We headed back to his house, and after we got there, Ryan asked me to call the police. For some reason, though, I didn't want to call them, and somehow Ryan agreed with me. My story doesn't quite end there, though. A few days after that, I was in a store buying something for my birthday. At some point, I noticed a guy wearing a black beanie. When he saw me looking at him, he winked at me and smiled, and I ran out of the store without buying the thing that I wanted to get. This happened almost 10 years ago, when I moved into my old apartment. I didn't have a lot of stuff, since I'd always been kind of a minimalist. The place came unfurnished, so it was pretty empty at first. During the few weeks after I moved in, I would browse around on Facebook Marketplace to pick up some used furniture for cheap. The things I needed were a desk, end tables, kitchen utensils, dishes, and a bed frame. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor at the time. One Tuesday night, I noticed a post on Facebook for a set of bowls and plates that looked decent. They were basically new, and the seller only wanted $10. I checked the price and found out that they were over $50 to buy new. Since it was such a good deal, I replied. Moments later, the seller, whose name was Mike, replied. His location was about a 20-minute drive from mine, but we agreed to meet at a gas station parking lot that was partway between us. At 8 p.m. that night, I got into my car and went. When I pulled into the gas station, there was only one other car there. There was a man standing next to it. I parked my car a few spots away and then approached him. He was about 45 years old, and he had a sly smile that I noticed right away. He introduced himself as Mike, but he didn't have the dishes in hand. He made some awkward small talk for a few minutes. I then told him I was new to the area and mentioned all the stuff I was looking for. We then talked about random stuff for about 5 minutes. Eventually, I interrupted and asked to make the trade. He seemed slightly annoyed, but walked over to his car and opened one of the back doors. Then he pointed inside. There was a box on the far seat from the door that was open. Mike asked me to get it since he had bad knees. I was really creeped out at this point, and I didn't trust him. I refused to go into the car, and after a tense 30 seconds or so, he agreed to get them out for me. Mike walked around the car and opened the other door, which was closer to the box. Then he picked it up and brought it around to me. I gave him the money, and I left. Although it was a strange and tense encounter, nothing really happened. It was just creepy. I wish that was the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, I was browsing again. There were still some things I needed. More than anything, I wanted an actual bed frame for my bed. Sleeping on the ground was getting old. As I was browsing the ads on Facebook, I saw one for a bed frame that looked pretty good. The picture was clearly just a stock photo from the internet, but the post said that it was in perfect condition. The seller's name was Drew, and the pickup location was not far from my place, maybe a 20-minute drive. I agreed to pick it up from his place that night. I was tied up with some stuff, so I had to go a little later than I wanted. It was 9:30 by the time I hit the road. When I got to Drew's area, it was completely dark. The houses were older there, and large trees sprawled overhead, blocking out what little moonlight there might have been. When I got close to the house, I sent Drew a message to give him a heads up that I would be there soon. When I got to his house, I parked on the street and got out of my car. There was a light on that I could see, so I was pretty sure I was in the right place. I walked up the pathway and up to his porch. As soon as I set foot on the porch, I knocked on the door. Within a few seconds, I heard a voice from the other side of the door.
"Come on in. It's open,"
the voice said. Stupid as it sounds, I reached for the doorknob for a second before talking some sense into myself. I knew better than that. Smart thing to do would have been to walk away right there, but I knocked again, ignoring the voice. This time, I heard a set of footsteps coming up to the door, and then it creaked open. Standing in the doorway was that same guy from before who sold me the dishes. I was confused for a second, because it was not the same Facebook account. The names were different and everything. As soon as we locked eyes, he asked me to come in, not even addressing the fact that we had seen each other before. He gestured with his arm that I should follow him, and then he said,
"I just need a hand with the thing. It's pretty heavy."
No part of me considered going into that guy's house. I didn't say a single word. I just turned around and went back to my car, and I drove home. While I was driving, my phone was blowing up with notifications. Being a responsible driver, I didn't check them until I parked my car. They were all from the Drew account, and all of them were angry messages, one where he threatened to slit my throat. Others were just crazy. The guy was the literal definition of a red flag. Fake names, endless attempts to get me into his car or home, and then those messages to top it off. With those points, I thought it was enough to involve the police. It's not a stretch to think that he would have done something to me if I had gone into his place. The police listened to my story, and they took it all very seriously. It's actually illegal to utter a threat, so even just some of his messages were technically breaking the law. From what I heard, the cops interviewed the guy after I gave him the address. He agreed to let them search the house, but nothing was found. No torture dungeon or anything. After that, they gave him a warning for the threatening messages, and that was the end of it. Although I appreciate what the police did, I still think he was up to more than it seemed. It still gives me chills to think of what would have happened if I went into that guy's house. My name's Nella, and I want to tell you about something creepy that happened to me. It all started when I was on Facebook browsing through Marketplace. I found an ad for some used toys. I run a daycare, and I'm always looking for new stuff. Things get worn out, and the kids get bored of what we have, so I'm always looking. The seller had a pretty big collection for a low price. There was nothing special, but it was worth it anyway. I messaged the seller, and they replied right away. They seemed friendly and said they were willing to meet up that same day. One strange thing that I noticed was that the profile didn't have a real picture. It was just some black text with a white background. Just some kind of inspirational quote. I don't really remember. The name was also just some random quote as well. I thought it was weird, but I didn't care at the time. The seller suggested that we meet at a Walmart parking lot. Not a problem for me. It was close to my house. One red flag, though, was that they wanted to meet at around 11 p.m. I agreed to do it anyway. I hopped into my car and drove to the Walmart. The parking lot was big, and there were a few cars scattered around. It was well lit, so I felt safe. After I found a spot under a lamppost, I pulled out my phone to check my messages. The seller had told me to meet around back, behind one of the other buildings. The Walmart was in a large plaza with other stores. The seller wanted to meet behind a different one that was across the parking lot. It looked dark over there, and there were no cars. I started my car and followed the directions. When I got there, I had a bad feeling. It was a dark alley with a brick wall on one side. On the other side was a wire fence with overgrown bushes. There was a single light on the building, but it did little to fight the darkness. Just when I was about to leave, a car pulled up in front of me, blocking me from one side. I sat and watched as two men got out. They started walking towards me. I figured they were who I was talking to on Facebook, but they were not carrying a box of toys. One of them was empty-handed. The other was holding what looked like a phone. Not exactly terrifying, but I was creeped out enough that I wanted nothing to do with those guys. The man with the phone looked to have a large beard, but that was all I could tell in the dark. I started reversing my car to get out the other side, but two more men appeared behind me. These two were standing right near the light, so I could see them better. One was tall, about 6'4". The other was about 6 feet tall. They both had short beards and wore baseball hats, making it hard to tell much about their faces. The really scary part is that one of them was holding a crowbar, the other had a gun. As soon as I saw that, I honked my horn 3 times, then I put the pedal to the metal in reverse. Those guys got a fair warning. My tires screeched as I flew backwards. Thankfully, the men got out of the way. When I was free, I could see the two of them standing there, looking at me. I drove out of that parking lot and headed home. I called the police and reported what happened, but nothing came of it. The profile was gone the next time I checked, and I didn't really get any information on them. Not even a good description of their appearance. No license plate, nothing. The next day, I decided to do a bit of research. I looked up tips for buying things safely on Facebook Marketplace. One of the tips was to meet in a public place, but it also mentioned being cautious if the seller suggests a specific location. That seems odd. Seems pretty obvious, but look who's talking. I walked right into a trap. I may have been naive for going there, but what did they think I was going to do? Just sit in my car and let them rob me? Obviously, I was going to reverse out of there and run them over if I needed to. Criminals are not the smartest among us. If you think you can't get tricked into something like that, then maybe you're right, but that's what I thought before, and I narrowly made it out with my life. These events took place about 7 years ago. It's the reason I deleted most of my social media, even though I had over 10,000 followers at the time. I did my first year of college in the on-campus residences. After that, my roommate Darcy and I got an apartment that was a short bus ride away from the school. It was a newer place in a large apartment building, and it was near a big bus station. It was small, but there were 2 bedrooms and a balcony. Overall, not a bad place because it was clean. When we moved in, there was basically nothing there, not even curtains or a shower curtain in the bathroom. On the first weekend back in the summer, Darcy and I went to Walmart to get some basic stuff that we were missing. We went to the bus station at the bottom of the building. As we were waiting, we noticed a man who seemed to be watching us. It wasn't that obvious, and definitely not something to make a big deal of. It's only notable in hindsight. He was around my height, 5'10", with a black hoodie pulled up all the way. His brown beard was protruding from the hood, and I could just barely see his nose. That was about all I could tell. We got on the bus, and so did that guy. When we got to our stop, we stopped paying attention to him and got off the bus. I didn't see if he followed. We had completely forgotten about him at that point, so we went into the store and did our shopping. Darcy and I split up. She went to the housewares section, and I went to get some food that we needed. I was in the aisle with the condiments when I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was that guy from the bus stop. He introduced himself as Troy, and went on to say that he was in my program at school. I was in the accounting program, but I didn't recognize him from any of my first-year classes. He also looked to be at least 25, a little old, but there were some mature students in the program. I didn't want to be rude, so I played along. I wasn't scared of him, more annoyed. I tried to excuse myself and find Darcy, but Troy kept lingering around me. I started walking, but he kept pace by my side. After a few minutes, he asked for my Instagram. My account was public at the time, so I gave it to him hoping he would leave me alone. It seemed to work, but as soon as I gave it to him, he disappeared into the vast store, and I didn't see him again that day. Darcy and I headed home soon after. I was somewhat active on Instagram at the time. I wasn't making money or anything, not taking sponsorships, but I did have a decent following. When we got home, Darcy and I set some things up. We were happy to finally have curtains. Then I went to my room to check my Instagram. When I looked, I noticed that Troy had commented on every single one of my posts. That's crazy, because I had over 1,000 at that point. It was creepy, and I began to regret giving it to him. Then the messages started. He was sending me at least 20 messages every day. They were mostly just hey and what's up, but when I didn't respond, they started to get scary. We started class the next week. I was expecting to see Troy. I was kind of dreading it actually, but I never saw him at school. I was starting to question whether he was really one of my classmates. Actually, I was pretty sure he wasn't. I got curious, so I checked Troy's profile. What I saw was truly disturbing. It was all pictures of my apartment building. Some of them were focusing on my window. I knew he was at that bus stop at the time, but I had no idea how he found out which apartment was ours. I definitely didn't post anything that would give that away. I blocked his account right away and reported him. I had a talk with Darcy, and we both agreed that we should report it to the police as well. She'd had a stalker before, so she knew the danger, even in the early stages. The police gave Troy a warning, and then they told me to stay off social media for a while. I went a step further. I deleted all of my public accounts and increased the privacy settings on my other ones. I never add people who I don't know anymore. It's not worth the risk. I'm a 40-year-old guy, but when this happened I was 22 years old. It was right around the time when Facebook burst onto the scene. I was on MySpace before then. Some of you won't even know what that is, but it was basically the same thing as Facebook. It pretty much disappeared though, as soon as people started using Facebook. It all began on a normal day. I was sat in front of my computer, scrolling through my feed. A friend request popped up, and my curiosity got the better of me. This was when it was all new. I was not as cautious as I would be now. The person's name was Maya, and her profile picture showed a pretty attractive woman. I know how stupid that sounds, so take it easy on me. With a click, I accepted her request. Shortly after, a message from Maya appeared in my inbox. "Hey Alex, how are you doing?" I replied, "Hi Maya, my day's been good so far. How's yours?" Our conversation flowed pretty easily. Maya seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, and I found myself enjoying our chats. Days turned into weeks, and we kept talking almost every day. We sent some pictures back and forth, nothing too intimate, but she tried to talk me into sending some pretty revealing pictures. I was smart enough to decline. One day, however, Maya sent me a message that would make me question everything. She asked me for money. I had seen some documentaries about catfishing, and this was one of the biggest red flags. I wasn't that stupid, so I ignored her from then on. As time passed, Maya's messages flooded my inbox at all hours of the day. I unfriended and blocked her for that. Nothing happened for a few days, and then I got an email from an unknown person. This was back when you could see everyone's email on Facebook. To describe the email simply, it was a really desperate attempt at blackmail. I knew it was from Maya, or whoever she was pretending to be. That's because it had images that I had sent to her. The most embarrassing of which was just me in my bathroom, with no shirt. Cringy, I know, but not exactly devastating. The bottom of the email said that if I didn't pay some amount, I can't remember how much, then they would send the images to my entire contact list. I was creeped out, but just ignored it. I talked to my brother later in the week, and he did in fact get a random email with some pictures attached. I know it sounds like no big deal, but blackmail like this can be very serious. People have been ripped off for their life savings over scams like this. There have even been cases where people have lost their lives. It's no joke. I'm just glad my encounter with those creeps turned out the way it did. Not everyone is so lucky. The following story is true in its entirety. My name is Braden. I'm a 6'3" giant, and I weighed around 180 pounds during high school. I was pretty shy, and only stuck to a small group of friends. That was just a small piece of information that will make sense as we dive into the story. It was around 11:30 at night. I was tired, and about to fall asleep to screaming next door to my room. My sister was having a sleepover. My parents were asleep. As I was doing my nightly routine of falling asleep to Twitch, a barrage of girls barreled into my room. The girls immediately went to my window. The window is located on the side of the house, so that means that my window looks right into the neighbor's house. I can see my side gate leading to the backyard, so the girls at the window could see the gate to the neighbor's house. I felt something was off when the girls were giggling at the window for a total of 30 seconds to a minute. This next thing happened chilled me to the bone. I heard a knocking on the window, followed by this quote in a whisper. "Hey, let me in." When I heard this, I immediately got a sharp feeling in my chest, the feeling of fear and excitement. I got up from my bed, knowing I was going to face whatever was on the other side of the window. I pushed my way past the group of girls to find myself facing the window. I peeled back the curtains to find a short man. He looked up at me with great terror and somewhat in disbelief. When I was looking into his eyes, his pupils were huge. I'm telling y'all, this kid was high as a kite, but I remember seeing him around school. I wasn't too afraid when I saw him, and it didn't look like he had a weapon of any sort, but I noticed something. There were two men standing behind him in the background. They looked to be seniors that went to my school. I was a sophomore or a freshman at the time, so I knew they could easily overpower me, though I'm a big dude. The rest wasn't a big deal. I told them to get off my property, and they walked off. That's where the story gets interesting. After I told them to get off my property, I went back to my usual routine of watching Twitch. About 20 minutes later, I got a sudden urge to check and make sure they were gone for good. The first thing I noticed out of place was the gate. It was wide open. I was probably thinking of 1,000 different things at the time, but here was my thought process. My main thought was that they could easily have entered the backyard and entered the house already. That's because it had been 20 minutes, and a lot can happen in 20 minutes. My second thought was, what if they just opened the gate to scare me? My third thought was, what if they're peeking into the girls' room? I know that seems kind of random, but hear me out. My sister's room is located towards the back of the house, and if you look out the window, you can see the entire backyard from there. In that split second of looking at the gate, I immediately ran out of my room and down the hall to the kitchen. I checked the back door to make sure it was locked, and thank God it was. I then ran to my sister's room. The light was on, and the blinds were open. When you have the lights on in a house and it's pitch black outside, you can't see anything outside, but the people outside can see inside. Basically, it creates a mirror with a window. I told the girls in a quiet but concerned tone, the gate is wide open. They all shifted their gaze towards the window, looking out to the backyard. I immediately turned off the light to reveal who was on the other side of the window. There they were, standing outside looking in. Right when I turned off the light, they scattered from the window into the darkness of the backyard. I left the room to check the back door again. Thankfully, nobody was there. I waited near the back door for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 5 minutes. I finally gathered the courage to go outside to the backyard and face these people. I told the girls I was going to check. One of them wanted to go with me. I was fine with it because I needed all the help I could get. We went outside to check the backyard, and surprisingly, we found nothing. I was thinking that maybe we should call the cops, but I didn't want anybody else, including my parents, to get involved in the situation. I closed the gate and went back inside. I went from very sleepy to not being able to sleep. The next morning, the girls told me everything that happened last night while hanging out in the pool. Apparently, he got our location from SnapMap. One of the girls mentioned that to me. One of the guys was visiting a friend's house across the street to smoke something. The kid got the bright idea to come over to our house and probably try to get it on with one of the girls. In the end, the kid was deeply sorry about the entire incident. He said he was high and not to tell anybody about it. I still haven't told my parents about this incident, and I don't plan on telling them anytime soon.